Your observation?
Yeah.
Okay, got it, yeah. Gotcha, I think I'm one of those that, VGD design or VGD design? Oh, this is it.
Okay, guys.
Cool.
So we're a week away from our next test. Can you believe it?
Time flies.
Freak you out. And talk to me after class about your email.
All right, cool.
So this is the study list for the next test. I am happy to report that the last test that we did, the online version, I was very pleased with the grades that we got that last time around. So I think we're going to make the next test a digital test too. Everybody okay with that idea?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yay! So we're moving away from analog and into digital world, right? So we're going to do the test as an online test the next time around, which is 1 week from today. And I will give you guys a nice big wide open window for completing it. What that means is that gives me an opportunity to show a movie, which makes me very happy. So come Monday, we're going to do movie day here in the classroom. We'll have it continue on Wednesday's class because it's a longer movie. And I'm thinking that that might give me the opportunity to show another movie through the next section when we get into postmodernism as well. The reason I like the movies I've chosen, the movie that I would show you here is really tied to advertising, and I think it's very beneficial to watch. I won't have any testing from the movie, but it definitely kind of hits home some of the points that were already made in the lectures and through the examples that you've seen. And the next movie that I want to show after it, in the next section, the nice part about it is it kind of goes along with the same kind of thinking as far as how postmodernism is broken out. And so we have some really good examples there of how postmodernism works. And a lot of the names that we have on our list show up in that movie. So I like that movie also for that particular reason. I'd really like to show both movies to you in the coming weeks. So that's the plan. We'll see how we do with our time for the next section, if we can get that other movie in. But for this one, we're going to watch a movie on Monday, which means today I think I should be able to get through the lectures. If not, we have time now that I don't have to plan a classroom time for testing. So online test 1 week from today. I'll give you more details next week. And you have the study list. Are there any questions on anything that we've covered so far?
So you're gonna give us test. So basic test is doing 2 weeks. Is what you're saying?
Yeah. If
Okay, all right.
If I open up the test next Wednesday, then yeah, you'll have. I might open it up Tuesday, since there won't be any material from the movie that will be on the test. So if we have a movie on Monday, then I might just. But one way or another,
Okay.
it'll be a
Gotcha.
week that you'll have available to do the test. Okay, we're cool? Don't forget, you also have an observation that goes along with this. So you're going to be looking at either European modernism, which we're going to cover today, or American modernism. That's what you're looking for in your observation. And then there's also, I believe at this point, you should have enough information about doing extra credit. Any of you who are feeling like you're falling behind, there is the extra credit option that you might want to start thinking about. And I believe those are already up on Blackboard. So, and I know that I already wrote about part of it in the syllabus way back at the first weeks of class. So if anybody's like really feeling like they're struggling in here and they need an extra boost, look at the extra credit options. I give you three chances for extra credit. So, all right. So today, let's start out with question of the day, and then we're going to go into European modernism. So, who has a question of the day that they can ask? How about Theo?
How did Lester B advertised to people in the Midwest in the 30s?
Okay, so somebody tell me something about Lester Beale and the work that he was doing. Is that generalized, or is it more specific than that?
How did he advertise to people in the Midwest in the 30s?
Okay, what was his method of advertising, Kelly?
He was making posters for the WPA.
Okay.
he made the art style simple and to the point, so people can understand and they can read.
Good, good. And anything else that you want to add, Kelly? Okay, some points there. Who else has got a question of the day? Let's see, who hasn't asked in a while. Let's see. Anthony, we haven't heard from you in a while.
All right. What exactly were the Mad Men?
What were Mad Men? Adam, what were Mad
He's
Men?
the advertising guys in Manhattan.
Okay.
God, the Volkswagen ad.
What was that? Can you name any of the Mad Men?
Oh God.
I can't name any, but
I thought my great
see you,
uncle-
Jessica. I'm not ignoring you. I see you back there.
My great uncle actually did it. He was there at the time. I'll tell you a story. They were their firm had a Timex account, and you know the jingle takes a look and keeps on ticking. That was his agency. That was them. And they have a story where they took a Timex watch and they put on a boat propeller and they drove it along Long Island Sound and it still worked. And Timex paid for the whole thing. So there was like partying stuff.
Okay, Jessica, what were you going to add?
I was gonna say they were called Madden because they mostly worked at Madden Avenue.
Madison.
Madison, sorry.
Madison Avenue. Okay, yeah. And anything that you want to add to that, to any of those, Anthony?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. All right. Who else has a question of the day? Peter.
What made the CBS logo so successful?
Good question. Why was the CBS logo so successful? Adam has his hand raised. I'd kind of like to get some folks that don't normally answer the questions. You guys are getting kind of a monopoly going. Don't worry, you're going to get points for it.
I want more plates. The more plates, the better.
Anybody else? Sage, I'm looking at you. Yep.
It was the only network at the time that had a logo.
Okay. Yeah. A consistent logo. I'll give you that. Anything else that you want to add to this?
Well, its simplicity made it easily recognizable, and it was able to be incorporated into numerous other things.
Good. And anything anybody else wants to add to this, Jessica?
I realized he said the same thing I was gonna say.
Ah, shoot. Okay. Anybody else have anything else they want to add to this conversation? Adam.
It's interesting. I was just reading about how how much advertising marketing has changed now, about how we're reaching like millennials and also like Generation Z, where it's more like they want like authentic content, you know, like raw video kind of stuff. I mean, they're not exactly loyal to brands. They can see they know a fake when they see it, and it's about like conveying that you're authentic.
Yep.
To that Z generation. This is the next
Yep.
big frontier, for lack of better words.
It fits into this notion that we're going to talk about as we move into postmodernism called the DIY movement, so the do-it-yourself movement, and that all ties into that authenticity thing. So yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it's a different technique, and it kind of leads us. I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a conversation about whether or not we're moving into a new ism at this point, if we're past postmodernism already and we're moving into something else. We'll get there too. So, all right, good job, guys. So let me pull up the slides and then we can get through this today. And we're going to talk about another form of modernism. So I originally, way back when, would you mind hitting the lights? So originally when we started talking about, you can hit the crit lights also. Is it buzzing to anybody?
Yeah, it's buzzing. It's annoying.
Yeah, it's a youth thing. I can't hear it, but but young people can hear the buzzing of those things. In any case, when we started talking about modernism, I had said that there were actually two sides to modernism. There was the American modernism that had the name mid-century modernism, American modernism, American expressionism, New York school, New York expressionism. They had a whole slew of different names, but when we started talking about American modernism, it was all the stuff that we've covered, including the Mad Men and everything that we've talked about to this point. At the same time that this was going on, there was another kind of modernism that was going on, but this one was in Europe. And so for that reason, we call it European modernism. It's also known as the International Typographic Style. It's also known as Swiss design. So it's got it too has a bunch of different names. But when we start to analyze it, we're going to see that there's some really big differences between what was going on in the American modernist style versus what the European modernist style is. Specifically, when we look at the traits, here are some of those traits that we can associate with the European modernism or the International Typographic Style, or Swiss design, whatever we want to call it. They only used sans serif typography. Whereas in America, we saw Bradbury Thompson, we saw Paul Brand, we saw Lester Beale, we saw even Alan Lustig at times using serif typefaces. The European modernists never used serif typefaces. They only used sans serif, and typically they only used Helvetica or Univers. They also would use Accidents Grotesque, but that's it. Those were the only fonts that they used. Usually they only used one cut of those fonts, meaning that they didn't use bold, they didn't use italic, they just used Univers 47, period. And that was it, and throughout the entire piece that they did. So that was one of the traits. They also had a very strict underlying grid structure for all the things that they did. It was very mathematically proportionate. It was always based off of the square, or a golden rectangle, or an A format rectangle. I'll explain what those are in a few minutes. The things that they did have that were similar to the United States was a balanced use of white space, which we saw the Americans did too, and this use of asymmetrical alignments. The Americans were doing that too. Very few of the American modernists were actually centering all of their stuff on their page. They did very asymmetrical alignments. For the Europeans, they took that a step further, and whereas the Americans were kind of all over the board as far as what their alignments went, a lot of times their alignments were actually kind of randomized alignments. For the Europeans, they held onto a very strict flush alignment, so their type was either flush left, rag right, or flush right, rag left. Very seldom was it justified, very seldom was it centered, very seldom was it random. So almost in every single case, you can see a very clear alignment, vertical alignment in the typography. And then lastly, with the Europeans, whenever they used photography or image, it was almost done in an object style way, and it was almost done so that the photograph was not subjective, it was very objective, meaning that it was very clear that the image related to what was being sold. There was absolutely no joking around with the way that they did things. They were very, very strict about making sure that the image and the related back to what the product was that was being sold. Okay? So I'll give you another minute to write these down if anybody's writing down. And we're going to go on and I'll explain. So if you need me to come back to this at the end of the class, I will. So ultimately, when we start to look at Swiss design, or European design, Swiss design, we want to look at these qualities. So here is an example of Swiss design, and we can very clearly see the idea of the sans serif typography that's being utilized here. Even if we don't see the grid, we can feel the structure of a grid, of a gridular structure, just even in looking at how the letters are formed and how exactly equal the proportions of these letters are created. Now, these letter forms were actually created as illustrations, but they still feel like they're very regimented, very grid-like, very mathematical in the way that they're working. That idea, the flush right alignment is going on here. The idea of not changing out the weights of the fonts, just keeping one consistent typeface throughout the entire piece for the type that's at the top, very clearly there, so we don't have a lot of size variation, and overall, all the other elements, the asymmetrical alignment, the balanced use of white space, all of those are being applied here in this example. So in the 1950s, there were really, again, as I mentioned, there are two different schools, the Europeans and then the Americans. This definitely does not look like anything that we've seen so far with the Americans, but this is very endemic of the way that the Europeans were working. The Europeans strove for clarity in the posters that they were doing. Now, for us, because we don't read German or whatever language, it's German, that these were written in, it's hard for us to understand what the words were. But the reason why these guys were playing with this idea of simplicity was so that the message could be very, very clearly displayed. Whatever borough is, that's the product that's being sold in this particular advertisement, and obviously it's something that's happening from September 29th to October 15th in 1928. And it's taking place in Basel, Switzerland, and Basel, Switzerland became kind of the capital for this kind of design. It came into Switzerland because of the oppression that the Nazis were creating. So Switzerland is historically known as a neutral country. They didn't allow themselves to get involved in World War I. They didn't allow themselves to get involved in World War II. And they've always tried to stay out of any kind of conflict. So when a lot of those artists in Germany found that they were being ostracized or being pushed out of Germany, one of the places that they chose to move to was Switzerland. And so not only did the United States benefit from the Germans and the rise of the Nazi powers as far as America getting all of these new artists in, but so did Switzerland. And so a lot of these Swiss designers ended up coming there, or these German designers ended up going to Switzerland, and they started to incorporate all the things that they had already been learning and teaching at the Bauhaus. And they started to apply them into the educational system for design and art in Switzerland as well. So they decided, because their goal all along at the Bauhaus had been this idea of neutrality, to emphasize the idea of typography being the most dominant thing in the pieces that they were doing. So over and over and over again, we see that typography is probably the main component in everything that they did. And this was, again, trying to get rid of the notion of any kind of a political cause. Typography, as far as these guys were concerned, was probably as clean and simple as you possibly can get. And you can read, especially if you use typefaces like Helvetica and Universe, which are very, very neutral and purposely designed to be neutral, you can read as little emotion into those fonts and into just straight typography as possible. And that was really kind of their goal. They were trying to be as non-political as possible. You can see this particular poster has an image that's being incorporated, but somehow this poster has something to do with the space that's being created here. And again, it's the typeface. We've only got two different point sizes here, only one weight on the font that's being incorporated here, so very, very minimal, very little in the way of imagery, photography, and so on. One of the things that people say, the detractors of Swiss design, the people that want to criticize it, say about it, is that it is so simple and so clean that it's almost personality-less. And I would agree. When we looked at American modernism, one of the thing that was great about it is we could start to tell whose work was whose. Saul Bass had a style. Paul Rand had a style. Alvin Lustig had a style. Lester Beale had a style. Sippy Pinellas had a style. They had a style, and you could look at it and say, oh, that's that person just from looking at it. Not necessarily so with Swiss design. So what we really want to do is we just want to, I just have a couple of folks that I'm going to ask you guys to know about these Swiss designers, just because their style is so very difficult to interpret. And all I'm going to ask you to do is to recognize the difference between the two designers that we're talking about. This is not one of the designers, but it's just an example of early Swiss design and how they were incorporating simple things that we play with in our foundations classes. So the idea of simplicity of forms and using quantity relationships and hard geometric forms. So anybody that's taken one of the foundations classes with me, you'll recognize that, you know, the simplicity of shapes and forms being utilized here or even here. The first guy that really gets any attention from us for being part of the Swiss design movement is, his name is Ernst Keller, and he is not going to be on your test, I promise you. But we can see, again, his initial ideas are very, very simplistic and very, very geometric in the way that they're done. He is considered one of the founders of the Swiss or European modernist style, and he applied his skills in teaching in Zurich, Switzerland. He started teaching when he was 27. He retired when he was 80. So he taught Swiss design for this design style for a very long time. Very, very quiet kind of man. But he influenced a lot of other people in his work when he was designing posters and so on. People looked at the examples that he was using and recognized how beautiful his stuff is. Now, I like this poster. I like to point out because some of you, again, who have heard me and had me in other classes might say, okay, but there's no white space on this particular poster. And that is correct. There's very little white space. The entire poster is filled up with stuff. But this is an example of where we're using typography, these big character forms in the background as the white space. So if we analyze the poster without actually noticing what the letter forms in the background, and just kind of blur our eyes and let that orange kind of fill in, we can still see that we've got a lot of white space through the orange spaces. And one of the things that the European modernists really tried to capitalize on was this idea of succession, meaning quantity relationships. We'd already seen it with Herb Matter when he was doing very large foreground images, middle ground images, and small images, and he would make them, each one of them at different proportions, but it was always in a 1, 2, 3 kind of step. Same thing that's going on here, where we have, if we look at the amount of space that's being utilized for each of the different components, we're going to see that there's a similarity to them. Like, for example, the height of these two lines right here is very similar to the height of the characters on the lines above. They're half the size of that, and when we combine those lines together, they almost make up the height of the characters as well. Mathematical proportions becomes really key to what these Swiss designers were doing. They were really looking at the overall composition. They were always trying to align things to the center points, the halfway points, or to the 1/3 grid lines. And even when they were turning things on an axis and trying to play with things in different ways, they were still playing with this idea of this nice tight alignment and having a very tight geometric form. So really, Ernst Keller was the foundation, the guy that inspired the people that followed him. But the two people that I really want you to know are one of them is, his name is Armin Hoffman. And his work is shown here in this poster. And again, if we look at this, we can start to recognize the quantity relationships with the white space versus the negative space versus the positive forms, and how that creates a relationship up into itself. So that we've got a small quantity right here to a larger quantity here, to the overall white space being the third relationship, the third quantity relationship in this study. And that's not the only way that these guys are playing with proportions in mathematics. You can also start to see the idea of grids being cut out into the letter form here, so squares and so on that are being utilized. And if we start to dissect it, we can start to see that there was actually some math into this. The grid for this poster is really reliant upon the square in the structure. And again, if we find the grid right here, that grid right here, we can see that it's aligning to different points just within the typography itself. That's just a simple part of it. But the structure of the overall format for the poster of this, the poster itself, is reliant upon that square also. And this is using something that we call an A format rectangle. An A format rectangle is a European standard. If you ever go to purchase paper from for European purposes, you're going to find that they have A size papers. A size, B size, or C size papers. And the A size papers are always in this proportion. So that A proportion is always based upon the idea of the square. So they start out with a square, whatever size they want it to be. In this particular case of the Europeans and their European model, that square, the overall proportion is equal to 1 square meter, exactly 1 square meter, when they measure it out. So whatever that measures out to in inches, it doesn't really matter as far, because they're using millimeters and centimeters in their measurement system. But one way or another, if you were to measure it out, this rectangle in the European format is 1 square meter. So they start out with an A0, and then when they cut that shape in half, then it becomes an A1, and then they cut that in half, it's an A2, cut it in half, A3, cut it in half again, it's an A4. Each one of them is exactly the same proportion as the one above it. And an A4 paper is pretty much the equivalent to the American version of 8.5 by 11. So when you get to a large size paper, cut it in half, cut it in half, cut it in half again, then you're down to a sheet of paper that's about the same size as an 8.5 by 11. Slightly different, but closest in proportion to that. And then they cut it in half again, cut it in half again, cut it in half again, and you get business card size. So if you ever get a business card from somebody in Europe, you're going to see that the size is odd. It's like, this is weird. It's not the same size as American business cards, not the same size as American letterhead, not the same size as American envelopes. It's because they're working with A format. But let me just continue on to this explanation of this A format rectangle, because this poster is in an A format, and a lot of these designers were using an A format rectangle. The A format rectangle measures out to a proportion of 1. So if you measure this, this is 1, and then the height is 1.4142. If you were to take the number 2 and find the square root of it, guess what that number is? 1.4142. So this measurement not only is the square of a square meter in size, but it's also the same number as the square root of 2. So no matter what proportion you go into, it's always going to measure out to the square root of 2. To create this shape, what they do is they create the square, and from the axis of the diagonal, from the corner point to the top of that square, if you were to create an arc, like say, I'm going to just use this ruler as an example, if you were to create an arc just like you swing a door open, then that measurement from corner to corner, from here to here, is the 1.4142. So when it swings out open, it comes to 1.4142 there. So that arc, that could be over here, but one way or another, it's still creating that measurement that is the European model, the European standard for paper. That's one of our measures. The other measure that they use is a golden rectangle. And a golden rectangle is also a really beautiful rectangle. It historically goes back a very long way. We've been noticing this shape since the days of the Egyptians, back in the days of the Romans. This measurement actually has a name. It's called phi. So in mathematics, if you're ever talking about the number 5, you're talking about a golden rectangle proportion. The golden rectangle proportion measures out to 1.618. Is 1.618. So again, this particular rectangle measures 1 from this corner to this corner, and then all the way to the top, it would be 1.618 is the measurement of that height, regardless of what those actual numbers are. That's the proportion of it. This number is really beautiful in a lot of other respects, but just to note how to create this golden rectangle, one way to do it, besides knowing this proportion, this proportional system, is to take that square again, the original square, and instead of going from corner to corner like we do in the A format, you go from the halfway point of the rectangle to the corner, and then again that arc, when you arc it up, will measure out from here to here is 1.618. So when you arc it up, it will come to that point at the top. Further, this new rectangle that you created at the top is also a golden rectangle. So if you were to take that proportion again, you would find it does the same thing. And so this rectangle, this new addition to the regular square, becomes another golden rectangle. So it does that. And here's another golden rectangle right here. And what you start to notice is that it's creating a spiral, right? Have we seen this shape before? I hope so, because it's found everywhere in nature. It's the same shape that you would find your water going down the drain. It's the same shape that a nautilus shell has. It's the same shape that is used for flowers when they bloom, so they spiral outward into the same pattern. It's the pattern that we see in pineapples and pine cones. So over and over again, we see this golden spiral, what it's called here, utilized. This name, this word, or this idea of the golden spiral also translates into a mathematical sequence called the Fibonacci sequence. Anybody familiar with that one? Where have you heard it before? The Fibonacci sequence, or what is it used for? Anybody know? What do you know about it?
A lot of people, when they're creating posters and art and different forms of art, they'll usually try to keep all of the most important content in like the closest swivel,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'll spiral outward.
Right, so if you're looking at paintings like Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, you'll see that the center of that golden spiral is faced upon her face, and right onto the corners of her lips become part of that curve. And then it arcs upward into her head and to the outward edges of the page. So the most important part is right there at the center of the spiral. And you can find painting after painting after painting of the great masters who are playing with this spiral itself. So that Fibonacci sequence is another way of saying that proportion. The proportion goes 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 to 8 to 13 to, and it just keeps on going. You're taking the number before it, adding it to it. So 1 to 1 would be 2. 2 plus 1 equals 3. 3 plus 2 equals 5. 5 plus 3 equals 8. 8 plus 5 equals 13. That's the Fibonacci sequence, and that creates this spiral. So if you were to even just try to calculate it out, you would find that it calculates out into this spiral format. If anybody here is a fan of the book, The Da Vinci Code, somewhere along the line they bring up the Fibonacci sequence and how they use that to solve a lot of the puzzles that they're faced with in that particular book. And it's one of those things that code breakers like to use. But further than that, this idea of not only this Fibonacci sequence and the golden spiral are used in a lot of other places that we don't even recognize or notice. Like, for example, the growth patterns of trees and bushes and shrubs and any kind of plant that branches outward, grows outward in that same mathematical proportion, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. So you'll find that each one of the branches that spreads out goes out into create that additional, that sequence,
This is exponential growth. You probably plot on a parabola, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then the birthing rates of creatures like rabbits follows the Fibonacci sequence. So we can basically follow the trajectory of population growth using the Fibonacci sequence. And here's my favorite one. We have the Fibonacci sequence in our own bodies. Right here, or actually not even the Fibonacci sequence. This idea of the golden rectangle right here in our bodies. That 1 to 1.618 proportion is right here in our bodies. First off, that spiral, it's in our DNA. So if you look at the spiral, the curve of the spiral in a DNA sequence of the DNA curves,
Helix.
it's that helix, yeah, is following that same curve of the golden rectangle. If we look at our bodies and the proportions of our bodies, this first knuckle, this first tip of your finger, if you were to bend it, the measurement from here to the next knuckle is 1 to 1.618. If you do it again from here to the next number, it's 1 to 1.618. If you do the entire length of your finger, it's 1 to the back of the hand, 1.618. If you did the entire length of the hand to the forearm, it's 1 to 1.618. And you can do the whole thing through your entire body, the length of this to your torso, the length of your head to your waist, down to your feet, 1 to 1.618. We have this innately within our bodies. These European modernists knew this, and they were intrigued. It gave them chills. it excited them to have this mathematical proportion. So when they started to do these posters, they pulled in these natural mathematical proportions into the things that they were doing. A lot of people look at it and go, oh my God, that's math, you're making me think. But to these guys, what they were trying to do was actually create perfection. And they saw that these posters, and by applying this mathematical science into what they were doing, was creating a new form of perfection. And ultimately, that's what the Bauhaus had been trying to do. The Bauhaus had been trying to take things away from the idea of politics and emotion and all of that stuff. There's nothing less emotional and less political than mathematics, and that's what these guys were doing. They said, let's just get rid of all of that, and we're just going to use those proportions that are mathematical. So in every single one of the posters that these guys were creating, somehow, one way or another, whether you see it or not, those mathematical proportions were part of the underlying structure of what they were creating. Just even in thinking about what the point sizes on the type were going to be, it was all reliant upon those mathematical proportions once again. They were very, very tight in how they were creating these.
That's how Leonardo da Vinci got, the picture of the man and the woman kind of mashed together.
Mhm.
So, okay, I always wonder how he did it because he wasn't taking muscle mass into consideration with a flat drawing. So I wonder how the
Yeah, no,
math right.
yeah, no, it was mathematics, and so these guys were playing with, again, very simplistic kind of imagery, but playing with the idea of mathematical proportions, and so we can see there's kind of a beauty and an artfulness in just having straight linear configurations in the things that they were doing. So not only is it just about strict alignment to the grid and asymmetrical alignment and sans serif typography, but it was really also about how to create things using strong strong grid structures. So Armin Hoffman was one of these folks that was part of this, and he was part of the advertising world in Switzerland at the time. And actually, I take it back, he was also, let me go back and look at my notes, design philosophy, so advocates of the grid, grid, spiral, okay, all right. So that, again, he was working with very simplistic forms, very simplistic typography, but always having an underlying structure to them. The other person, so let me clarify, Armin Hoffman was a teacher, but he was really probably the more simplistic of the two of them. The other person I want you guys to know is Joseph Müller-Brockmann. And these guys are in your book, so if you want to read anything about them, that's in there. But as far as I'm concerned, between the two of them, Armin Hoffman had the simpler style. Joseph Müller-Brockmann was more complex in what he was doing. First off, he played with more colors than what Armin Hoffman did. Armin Hoffman almost exclusively used black, white, and red, which was kind of a constructivist color palette. But again, taking, the colors of Russia, black, white, and red were utilized, but in their particular case, it had absolutely no relevance to politics at all. They chose those colors because they had the most contrast. So red against a white background has very high impact, high contrast. And black against a white background has very high contrast. Red on top of either one of those two colors has very high contrast. So that's why that color palette worked. Joseph Müller-Brockmann was not afraid to use other color palettes, and he was not afraid to create more dynamic grids than what Armin Hoffman did. He also was not afraid to utilize the imagery more in the stuff that he did, or to use it to convey what he was trying to say. He did an awful lot of projects that were public service projects, so this was actually, this is an advertisement for an insurance company, and it's about handshakes and helping in your auto insurance policy, what's happening here. So, and then this one was a poster about noise pollution. But ultimately, this next one is probably his most dynamic poster in its simplicity. It's about a film festival, and so what he's done is he's taken the words the film, or der Film, and he's overlapped them like splicing together two pieces of film. And again, looking at this, we can notice that there's only one typeface that's used in this, same weight. The point size is big here, but the type size for the rest of it is all consistent. consistently the same, and we can definitely see the proportions of the grid, the idea of the square, and the overall structure of the organization that's going on here. Clear use of white space in this, and a very elegant way of using white space. But then he gets into some more complex stuff in some of his other posters, and you can see that he really does try to take advantage of doing stuff that has some complexity. The posters like this one here and these ones that seem to be a little bit more complex were because he did a lot of music festivals. So Beethoven was a favorite topic of these German-Swiss designers, and so there were a lot of concerts, and in this particular case, I don't think it's about Beethoven, but ultimately it is about a music concert. You can see Musica Viva is the name of the concert, and what's being utilized here. Here's another poster that has, it's about a poster show. Here's another one for a music concert, so Musica Viva, and this one, again, very clean and organized. And this again is a music concert poster. And then this one itself, this is probably one of my favorite ones for the music concert posters that he did. And the topic here is Beethoven and the idea of the music and the spinning. But when we look at this and understand exactly how tight his structure was, here are some of his sketches that he used to create this poster and the grid structure that he developed with it. So as I said, he took his idea of grids to a greater level than what Armin Hoffman or Ernst Keller had done. Yes, Christopher?
Was he a professor as well, or
I
was he
believe
just an artist?
I believe he, I keep on getting them confused. I can't remember if Armin Hoffman or Joseph Mueller-Brockmann were, which one was the professor. I think it was Armin Hoffman was the professor and Joseph Mueller-Brockmann was the guy that worked in advertising in Switzerland. So don't quote me on that, but do you know that this one, the Beethoven poster, or the one before this, where are you? There we go. That this belonged to Joseph Mueller-Brockmann, whereas the original one that we showed, that I deconstructed for you, that one belonged to Armin Hoffman. Regardless of it, there's a beauty, there's an elegance to what they're saying. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question because I haven't looked at my notes lately, and I don't seem to have them here. I should, but I don't. Any other questions on European modernism? Because what ends up happening is this style becomes very, very relevant in the late 1940s, 1950s. European modernism is really picked up. It's big. Not just in Switzerland, but starts to be utilized in all places of Europe. And the reason for it is because of the simplicity, because Europe is a place where we have all of these different languages going on at the same time, and two people might not speak the same language, but by having these very simplistic posters, it's very easy to digest the information in them, and even if you don't know everything that's being said, you can certainly pick out dates, and you can pick out the subject matter just from looking at the words. And so again, international typographic style is because the typography was a very integral part to the solutions that they were coming up with. Which leads us to this thing that happens now as we move from European modernism and American modernism into a way that these designs start to come together. And we've already seen it a little bit when we look at advertising, what those advertisers were doing. If you didn't notice already, the advertisers are using a lot of clean white space. They're lining things up on grids. Some of them are using sans serif typography. So they're already letting this European modernist influence start to permeate into the United States. And there's a reason for that. And that's because the United States and Europe are becoming more global. The economies are becoming more global, more intertwined. And a lot of American companies are now starting to move over to Europe. Case in point, IBM. IBM stands for International Business Machines. International is in the name. And so they're no longer just making typewriters and adding machines, which is what the original part of the company was about. Now they're making machines that are used internationally for audiences all over the place. They were the first ones to actually develop what we call a PC, a personal computer. So when we think back to IBM and its roots, we think to the original computers that people had as personal computers. And once we had companies like IBM and Alcoa and Dow and others that were starting to work on an international basis, they were seeing that they needed to migrate their American personality over into the European personalities. And so they had to find a way that worked in both places. And so a lot of them just went ahead and converted their style over to this European modernist style. And they looked to designers who had the best capabilities in that arena. One of them was Paul Rand. We've talked about him already, and we've looked at his examples of early advertising. Now, as he gets into this, a couple of decades past the advertising years and into this infiltration of European modernist styles into it, as a self-taught designer, he's eager. He grabs onto this eagerly and takes on the idea of what he can do as far as branding goes and what corporate identity goes. So he was given the task of reinvigorating IBM's personality with this European modernist sensibility way back when, in the 1950s. And so what he did was he started to look at what IBM already had, and he made some decisions as a graphic designer and a corporate identity specialist, which is what he ultimately became. He, created what we call a war room, where he hung up all the different pieces that IBM was producing at that time and tried to find the things that were the commonalities between them. And one of the things that they had was this typeface that he thought was kind of clunky, but could be used. He did some tiny little tweaks to it, but he ultimately kept the typeface the way that it was when it first started out. The philosophy that Paul Rand had for corporate branding, corporate identity, was you don't make radical changes unless you're a new company. So if you're a new company, yeah, you have the right to go ahead and create whatever kind of logo that you want to. But once you have that logo established, which IBM did, you don't go changing it in major radical ways, or else you're going to lose some of your customer base. And we've seen a lot of companies do this in the last 10, 15 years. JCPenney did this, and that was a disaster.
Didn't Staples change that recently?
Right, they just did actually.
I'm sorry?
I think they did.
I can't remember if I haven't shopped at Staples in such a long time that it's hard for me to say.
I think they changed it like this year.
Gap did it, and they really got hit over the head for that one. And there have been a number of companies where they just they did a radical redevelopment of their logo, and the client base rejected it and said, nope, we're not going to go for that. So in Paul Rand's case, he chose to take the idea of IBM and just do tiny little nuanced things. So one of the first things that he started to do was to incorporate the idea of stripes into the logo. And so he did it by started out with colors, adding color into what was part of the IBM identity, and then eventually he started to incorporate stripes into that identity. And it was supposed to be emblematic of this new digitized version of working on computers and the computer monitors and how the screens cut the letter forms off.
Apples used to be, I'm sure you guys are back before your time, the original apple had stripes on it. It was rainbow stripes. Now it's just a solid black. It was a red apple.
There's a rainbow stripe.
Yeah.
Yep. So not a new idea. And this was way before Apple came along. So in any case, the idea of incorporating this colorful kind of palette so that their logo started to become this very colorful, give this colorful impression, and over again, they slowly, little bit by little bit. So every year he would add something new, some little twist into the branding and the identity. But as IBM grew, Paul Rand realized that he could not keep up with all of the stuff that was going on with the company. It was an international company, and they were putting out all kinds of stuff. Whether it was people in the company and the thousands of people in the company that all needed business cards, or if it was creating new packaging, or putting the logo on some of their products, or whatever. He realized that he couldn't do everything, and so one of the ideas, the brainchildren that he came up with was the idea of a corporate identity manual or a standards manual. And in this, what it would do was it would explain to other designers who worked for the company the do's and don'ts of using this logo. So that instead of having a war room where some of the things in the room looked like each other and some things did not, he decided to give them rules so that they would always know the right way to work with the corporate brand. And that was something that became very, very popular from that point forward. So from the 1950s forward, thanks to Paul Rand, we started to develop branding and corporate identity standards manuals. To this very day, corporations that have a very strong brand will have a corporate standards manual. And even companies that don't have a strong brand, they should have some kind of a corporate standards guide so that they always know how the logo is supposed to be used and what fonts are supposed to be used, what their color palette is, and so on. How tight it is depends from place to place. But that was, again, very instrumental to this idea of the Swiss and organizational structure of the Swiss design. Paul Rand also came up with the idea of the corporate annual report. Now, this wasn't a new idea. In fact, after the stock market crashed in the late 1920s, the U.S. government developed something called the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and one of the things that the Securities and Exchange Commission mandated for any corporation was that they had to put out an annual report every year. Now, the annual report didn't have to be much. It just had to go out to every shareholder in the company to tell them where their funds were at, what they were spending the money on, and where, how the money was apportioned out over the years, so that they wouldn't have these paper companies that actually had no money at all in their coffers at the end of the year. People that invested in the companies actually had a sense of security in knowing that the company had some financial basis. Paul Rand said, okay, well, these companies have to do this on an annual basis. Why don't we turn this into a promotional piece? So instead of just publishing the financial figures, which is the requirement of it, he turned the first part of an annual report into a sales tool. And the first part of every annual report from that point forward became a projection of where the company is going in the coming year, or just even an explanation on what they had done. And he did it with lots of big pictures and, basically an explanation on where they were going, what their plan was, what they were developing in the year. This was a great place to say what the company's goals were, what their mission statement was, and how they saw themselves moving forward. And this was also a great way to get people on board as stockholders. So anybody that wanted to, if they had money to spend, they could call up the company or mail the company and say, send me a copy of your annual report, and then use that as a decision in making a decision about what you were going to invest in the coming year. And all the stockbrokers had this and so on. Unfortunately, this has gone by the wayside. It was for a very long time a mainstay for a lot of graphic design firms to do an annual report. If you had an annual report, that was golden. That was like, oh, annual report, yes, it's a jewel project, and they would spend tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on their annual report every year. New photography and innovative designs, really beautiful annual reports. And then the internet came along and that wiped that all out. Nobody's doing annual reports in print version, or very few people do annual reports in print version, because now all you need to do is just go up onto their website and you can pull up their financials. In any case, so Paul Rand helped to figure out new ways to innovate the company. He went on and did a lot of other corporate graphics, corporate identity programs. Besides IBM, he did the logo for ABC. He developed the identity for Next Computers, which was where Steve Jobs went when he was fired from Apple before he was rehired by Apple. He did the UPS logo, which had remained unchanged until about 5 years ago, and then they revamped the logo again. The new logo really isn't all that different from what Paul Rand did here. And he did the Westinghouse logo, which still lives on to this very day. It hasn't changed a lick. So even though Paul Rand is no longer with us, his logo certainly is. Other logos that have had staying power and utilize this idea of the European modernist sensibility, strong geometric forms, and very simplistic configurations. The Chase Manhattan Bank logo, or the Chase logo, as we see it here, was designed by a firm called Shermaier von Geismar. And Shermaier von Geismar was made of two guys, Tom Geismar and Ivan Shermaier. Both are first-generation Americans. Their parents had been European. And they formed what they called a design agency. And that was the first time anybody had ever conceived of the idea of a design agency. Up until that point, it had all been commercial artists or advertising. So nobody ever conceived the idea of design being in a studio. But these guys did, and they took on the idea of corporate branding for what they were doing. The Chase Bank, again, if we want to look at it in its rudimentary form, it's circular in shape, but it's also square in shape, and it's got triangles. And so anybody, again, who's taken Design Foundations class knows that those three shapes tell the whole story. Circles imply friendliness, whereas squares imply neutrality, and triangles imply forward motion. And so by creating this logo that's got all three of those things, those components at the same time, they're trying to give the personality of this bank as something that does everything for everybody. Further, they chose to use a sans serif typeface for the original logo type that they were using for the bank. It was all based upon the proportions that you would see if you were a pedestrian walking through the city of New York and looking up at the buildings. The letters were foreshortened, and so they decided that fit into the sensibility, original sensibility when they were developing the logo, to use these the sans serif typeface that had kind of a squat appearance to it. They also developed the logo for mobile, which is still in use today, and they designed a lot of other logos that you can see here, many of which are still operational, still in use. Here's another one, some of the logos that they've used. So we recognize a lot of these logos that they developed, and this was, again, their specialty, was developing logos, all utilizing that European modernist sensibility. Probably the greatest of the European modernist designers that was working here in the United States was my old boss, Massimo Vignelli. Massimo Vignelli came to the United States and worked for a company called Unimark out of Chicago. And unfortunately, the company died because the American market hit into this great recession in the early 1970s, and it hit the design market really hard. So Massimo, the Unimark ended up closing, but Massimo ended up staying in the United States. He's an Italian designer. He obviously had some exposure to European modernist design. But his philosophy, and the philosophy of Unimark in general, is that you only needed like 2 or 3 typefaces in your entire repertoire. For the color palettes that they used at Unimark, they stuck with that black, white, and red in everything that they did. But as you can see here, they were able to create a whole line of materials just for one company, Knoll Furniture. And so you can see, again, a great assortment of different things that were all playing off of this idea of the grid and the fonts and so on that were created there. Massimo went on to form his own firm called Vignelli Associates. He teamed up with his wife Leila Vignelli, and they formed a firm together. And they went on and had some very major clients, including Bloomingdale's, as you can see here. He expanded his repertoire of fonts to about 5 to 10 fonts. I can name them all for you if you wanted. And his color palette went beyond just Pantone Super Warm Red, Black, and White, but started to include about 5 other colors into Pantone repertoire of colors that he would use. But he really didn't stray much further than that. He kept with that palette, he kept with those fonts, and he always had a grid. Always. Never broke the idea of having a grid. It was always there. Probably his most noteworthy project that he worked on was for the New York Metro Transit Authority, the New York subway system, in which he was asked to redesign the whole system for the signage in the New York City subways, which was a mess in the 1970s. people, it was actually a conglomeration of 3 different subway train authority lines that came together, and they all had their own kind of graphics, they all had their own naming system, and Massimo and this city authority got together and they renamed all of the trains. They associated colors with the different kinds of train lines, and so people started to get to know the train lines based upon this naming and numbering system rather than what kind of train line it was. Are you taking the IRT? No, I'm taking the IBT or IMT for the train system. People didn't know what the heck you were talking about unless you were a true and blue New Yorker.
Well,
now you could say, the LIR,
Yes.
going that. Now you could say, no, I need to take the F train up to 72nd Street, or we're going to cut across to the S train, and so people understood what that system was. So they developed a whole sort of a series of signage and so on that went along with it. Back to this for a moment. This particular map for the New York subway map that Massimo developed. This is how resistant people are to change. When people saw this map, they just went bonkers and said, nope, we're not going to do that. That doesn't look like New York to us. One of the things that he forgot to include on his map here was the river that cut Brooklyn and Queens away from Manhattan itself. And so people saw that and said, where's the river? We can't have this map. I don't know where the river is. I don't know where my stop is. It's like, I think you probably are aware of where your stop is. You're just being kind of a jerk about this. So people refused to buy this or to go along with this, and they came up with a map system that was more intrinsic to a regular road map. In the 2000s, they came back to this and they revitalized it, and at that point, New Yorkers were all ready for it. So they were like, oh, it's the most beautiful map we've ever seen in our lives. It's gorgeous. And it's like, yeah.
We tried this later. We tried this before.
We tried this before. You didn't like it. But in any case, it came back in popularity, and now you can actually go online. You can purchase copies of that New York City Transit Authority map the way that Massimo originally designed it. So there's this, and then the other thing that Massimo is best known for is the National Park System Unigrid system that he developed. So when we look at the park systems in any of our national parks in the United States, there's a structure to the way that it's all put together, and it's called the Unigrid system. So any piece that you will find at, Grand Canyon or Mesa Verde or Cuyahoga National Park System, Valley Park System, or Mammoth Cave, or choose a national park, it has the same structure. The grid that was developed by Massimo Vignelli is still in use today, even though Massimo is no longer with us.
And the website looks like it too. The website actually mirrors it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got longevity. It's got legs. Stays forever. Speaking of staying forever, symbol signs. This was another innovation that came along as a result of this European modernist mentality. Thanks to the AIGA, which stands for American Institute of Graphic Arts. It's an organization. If you don't belong to the AIGA, you should consider joining AIGA, especially as students, because as students you have the opportunity to take advantage of a very low cost for membership, and it's a great networking
Yeah, it's
organization.
$50. I went to one of their events like last week. They're really nice folks.
Yeah, they're great, and it's a great way to network and to find out what's going on in the area. So they have clubs all over the country. The Cleveland chapter, Adam just went to, but they have them all over the country. In any case, they consider themselves kind of a lobbying group, among other things. And one of the things that they noticed back in the early 1970s was that symbol signs were all over the place in airports. So if you went to an airport and you were looking for where you're supposed to park your car, or where you're supposed to pick up your bags, or where the bathrooms were, you would find a different symbol in every single airport, every single train station, every single bus station in the country would have all kinds of different symbols for these things that we use universally. And so the AIGA went to the U.S. government and said, there's a problem here. You know, we're a hub. A lot of European people are coming to the United States and they can't understand where the bathroom is. We should make it so it's easy for people to understand. And so they, the U.S. government said, yeah, okay, do that. And so AIGA turned to Tom Geismar of Schleif and Geismar and said, okay, up to you. You guys are specialists at branding and so on. Develop a series of symbol signs for that can be used universally throughout the United States. And that's exactly what he did. He, again, created a war room, showed all the different variations on what bathroom signs look like, parking signs look like, food, restaurant, asking questions and so on, elevators, all of that stuff. He created an entire room for it, and then he reconfigured, redesigned every single one of those symbols. And the beauty of this is they are free to all of us. So if, for some reason, you as a designer need that women's room sign, you can go onto the AIGA website, type in the search bar, symbol signs, and it will take you to a download where you can download any one of these symbols for whatever purpose that you want. If you're doing something where you're making a dot pattern out of the girl figures that are for the bathroom, go at it. They've given it away for free because they wanted to make sure that every designer in the country was doing things universally. So this was a way to combat that issue of everybody doing something different. And the government helped out because they made it mandatory. So whenever they would start to build new buildings, the architects had this set of rules that said you will use the symbol signs per the AIGA specifications, and gave all of that information away. Can you guys stay 5 minutes longer? Yes? Okay. Because I have one more thing I want to show you, and that is the Olympics. And the Olympics is another great example of where this universal, international kind of policy really works. And the first time that we actually see this idea of crossing over into corporate graphics, this merging of European modernist ideas into corporate graphics, it was displayed in 1968 with the 1968 Olympics that happened in Mexico. The designer for this was an American named Lance Wyman, and he was tasked with the idea of trying to create an identity program for the Mexico Olympics. Took place in Mexico City, and we can see that he's done a really clever thing here by turning those Olympic rings into parts of the letter forms for 1968. Further, he had a very firm grasp on what the culture was like in 1968. So he certainly is recognizing some qualities about Mexico, but he also understood the idea of op art that was really popular, and some of the psychedelic things that were happening in this time. But, obviously we can see the op art influence here, this kind of kinetic kaleidoscope feeling that we get from looking at this, but we can also recognize the heritage elements that he was incorporating into this. So he was playing off of the motif of Mexican folk art here, and then incorporating the color palette that we find in a lot of Mexican art. In this whole identity program that he was building. And he incorporated that into the signage and the other graphics that were part of this Olympics. So this is, again, an opportunity for him to play with the idea of creating icons and graphics that were universal, that you didn't have to have words to explain, that you could look at those symbols and understand what it was that you were going to. And they translated into all kinds of things. So they had these freestanding kiosks, they had people wearing clothing that was designed in the same fashion as what some of those symbols were. And of course the tickets were displayed so that you could have a ticket that had all of the information on it and didn't have any words on it. You didn't need it. It just had the information to tell you how to get from one place to what time your event was at, what symbols you should look for that event, and what your sporting event was that you were going to. And it was very, very effective. Folks said that this was so effective that you could navigate without having words, unless you were colorblind. And then it's like, oh, a little problem there. But you know, again, the symbols could work really effectively. And here's other examples of the things that they were doing for the motifs here. And again, it felt really like it was an effective, an intelligent way of taking that modernist idea of creating this universal corporate identity, but also having the feel of American qualities added into this. I mean, that idea of the psychedelic element in it, it's very much an American thing. It's not necessarily that European aesthetic anymore. It's tying those two areas together. This happened also when we get into the 1972 Olympics that were designed by a German, Otto Eicher, and he actually used the same graphics, again, not for the mark for the Olympics, but for some of the components, like, for example, here, I'm sorry, for some of the components like the symbols that they used for each of the events. They recycled this again for the 1976 Olympic, or the 1980. 72, I think it was 76, they also used the same symbols in them because they were so popular in this 1972 version that they recycled them again. But if we go backwards, we can see that Otto Eicher was creating the same thing that Paul Rand did in creating the branding standards. He had developed grids. He had charts and tables that told you exactly how to use those elements, and gave full explanation so that it wasn't just all on his shoulders. He had developed the system, and then anybody could apply them in what they were doing. And then he even created this series of colors that were utilized. And then again, recognizing how the times were changing, he incorporated this idea of using solarization in the photographs, so that he had this color palette that was very determined, very, very organized and part of the system, but then he would use photography in the same way that the European modernist aesthetic was, with this hard, clear, obvious image, and utilize this color palette that was very much part of this psychedelic era, and the colors and the techniques that were part of the psychedelic movement. So definitely playing off of what was happening at that time, when we understand what was happening with changes as far as culture goes, but still utilizing a lot of the techniques of this modernist aesthetic. And that's all I've got to show you guys. So on Monday we're going to watch a movie. And then on Monday I'll give you information about when the test is going to be available. Probably open it up for you guys on Tuesday. And next week is going to be movie week. So, questions? I can answer questions on Monday too if you come up with any. We'll do a question of the day on Monday. That's it. Thanks, guys.